My daughter called it a gift. She said, "Dad, you've been cooped up in that house since Mom passed. You need fresh air. You need water and sky and quiet." She said it with such warmth in her voice that I actually teared up a little. 63 years old and my own daughter could still make me cry just by being kind. I should have known something was wrong. I've been a licensed electrician for 34 years. I've crawled through walls, climbed towers in February, read blueprints in the dark. My whole career was built on one skill: finding the fault before the fault finds you. I was good at it, and I missed it completely with my own daughter. Her name is Reese. She's 31. When she was little, she used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms because she said my heartbeat was louder than the thunder. I never forgot that. Maybe that's why I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt long after I should have stopped. Her husband's name is Chad. I never liked him. Not because he was rude to me. He was always perfectly polite, in that careful way that people are polite when they're calculating something. He had soft hands and a firm handshake, and the kind of smile that appeared exactly when it was supposed to. He sold insurance, which I always thought was darkly funny in retrospect. They'd been married 6 years when the money problems started. Or rather, when I found out about the money problems. Looking back, I think the problems started much earlier, and I just wasn't paying attention. The first time Reese asked me for money, it was $8,000. She said they'd had an unexpected tax bill. I didn't ask too many questions. I wrote the check that same afternoon. She hugged me in the driveway, and I thought, this is what fathers are for. The second time was $11,000. A medical bill, she said, something with her back, a procedure her insurance didn't fully cover. I asked if she was okay. She said yes, just a little out of pocket. I wrote another check. The third time I asked more questions. $15,000 for what, exactly? She got quiet on the phone. Then she said Chad had made some bad investments, something about a business opportunity that didn't work out. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after we hung up, staring at my checkbook, feeling a small, cold unease settle in my stomach. I wrote the check anyway. My wife Linda had died 14 months before all this started. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to gone. After 37 years of marriage, I was suddenly eating cereal for dinner and talking to her photograph. I was not in good shape, and I think Reese knew that. I think she and Chad understood exactly how vulnerable I was, and they made a plan around that vulnerability. I found out later, much later, that Chad had a gambling problem. Not the kind where you lose $50 playing poker with friends on a Friday night. The kind where you wire $10,000 to an offshore account at 2 in the morning and then lie about it in couples therapy. The kind where the losses had been stacking up for years and the solution they landed on was me. I had a life insurance policy, $250,000. Linda and I had taken it out when Reese was born because that's what responsible parents did. Linda was gone. The beneficiary was Reese. The only thing standing between Chad's debt collectors and $250,000 was my continued existence. I didn't know any of this when Reese called to tell me about the fishing trip. She said there was a cabin on a lake in northern Minnesota, about 4 hours north of Minneapolis. A friend of Chad's owned it, she said. Beautiful place. The walleye fishing was exceptional in late September. She said she'd stocked it with groceries, with firewood, that it had a working generator and a propane heater, that I could spend a whole week out there completely alone with nothing but a fishing rod and my thoughts. "You always said you wanted to do that, Dad," she said. "Just you and the water." She wasn't wrong. I had said that. Years ago, when Linda was still alive, I used to talk about taking a fishing trip up north someday when I retired. Reese had remembered. That meant something to me. I drove up on a Saturday. Reese had offered to drive me, but I said I was fine. I still drove my own truck. I wasn't that old yet. She laughed and said, "Okay," and told me the access code to the lockbox on the cabin door. 4 numbers. I typed them into my phone. The cabin was exactly as she described it. Small, maybe 400 square feet, set about 30 yards back from the lakeshore. log walls, a covered porch with 2 wooden chairs, the kind of place that smells like pine resin and wood smoke before you even open the door. I stood on the porch for a moment and felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Peace, real peace. The lake was silver in the late afternoon light. There were no other cabins visible in either direction. I went inside. There were groceries on the counter. Bread, eggs, canned soup, coffee, a case of water bottles, firewood stacked by the hearth, a propane heater in the corner. The bed in the back room had clean sheets. It looked exactly like a gift. I made dinner, went to sleep early, and woke up the next morning feeling better than I had in months. I didn't notice anything wrong until the second day. I'd gone down to the dock before sunrise with my rod and a thermos of coffee. Sat there for 3 hours. Caught 2 walleye and released them both, which I always did. I never much cared for the cleaning. Around 9, I walked back up to the cabin, and that's when I saw that the truck was gone. I stood in the gravel and stared at the empty spot where I'd parked. My first thought was that I'd somehow sleepwalked down and moved it, which I immediately recognized as insane. My second thought was theft. My third thought came slower and felt worse. I went back inside. That's when I noticed the door. It closed behind me and I heard a sound that didn't belong, a heavy, metallic sound. I turned around. There was a hasp and a padlock on the outside of the door. I'd seen it when I arrived, but assumed it was just old hardware, the kind that's always on cabins. But someone had slipped a hardened steel shackle through the hasp from the outside while I was down at the dock. I pushed the door. It didn't move. I went to the front window. Nailed shut from the outside, 3 2x4s screwed across the frame with a drill. The back window, same thing. The little bathroom window, too small for a grown man to pass through, was the only one untouched. I checked it anyway, just to be sure. It looked out onto a concrete block foundation wall. I stood in the middle of that cabin and let the reality of it arrive slowly, the way bad things do when your brain doesn't want to accept them. And then I saw the envelope on the kitchen table. I had not seen it the night before. Someone had come while I slept, while I was at the dock, or both. The envelope was white, letter-sized, and my name was written on the front in my daughter's handwriting. I sat down. I didn't open it for a long time. I just looked at it. Outside, the lake was doing what it had been doing all morning, sparkling and indifferent, and somewhere a loon called once and went quiet. I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 paragraphs. I will not reproduce it word for word because I burned it later, but I remember everything it said. The first paragraph explained that Chad owed money to people who would hurt them if they weren't paid. A number was given. It was not a small number. They had tried everything, the letter said. They were out of options. The second paragraph explained the policy. She had looked into it, she wrote. The payout was $250,000. She would use it to pay the debt and start over. She was sorry. She had told Chad she didn't want to do this, but there was no other way. She hoped I understood. The third paragraph said that I should not be in pain. The cabin was cold and the heater would run out of propane in a day or 2. It would be like going to sleep, she wrote. It would look like exposure. An old man alone at a cabin in September, unprepared for this cold snap. Accidents happened. She had signed it with my nickname for her, a name I had called her since she was 3 years old. I read it 3 times. The third time, my hands were steady. That surprised me. Here is what I knew. The propane heater had a gauge. It read about 40%. The overnight low was forecast in the low 30s. Uncomfortable, but not immediately deadly. I had 3 days, maybe 4, before hypothermia became a serious risk. Here is what else I knew. I had a toolbox in the truck which was gone, but I was an electrician. I looked around the cabin with different eyes. The generator was outside, which I couldn't reach. But the cabin had electrical outlets, which meant there were wires inside the walls. The junction box was in the utility closet, and the utility closet was accessible from the inside. I opened it. The propane line for the heater ran from a tank on the outside of the cabin through a small penetration in the back wall to the heater unit. The penetration hole, where the line passed through the log wall, had been sealed with spray foam. But the hole was there, and the foam, I knew from experience, could be cleared with enough patience and the right implement. I had a fish fillet knife in my tackle bag. It took me the better part of an afternoon to work enough foam out of that wall penetration to get my arm through. Then a little more time to reach around the outside, feel for the propane line, trace it back to the tank and find the shutoff. I wasn't trying to shut the propane off. I was confirming the tank's position because I wanted to know whether the tank was strapped or resting on a pad. It was resting on a pad. I worked the propane line gently until I could feel the connector fitting on the outside. Enough wiggle room to shift the tank if I could apply lateral force. I carved a piece of wood from the edge of the firewood stack, used it as a pry. Took 2 hours. The tank toppled off the pad and the line disconnected. That meant no more heater. But it also meant I now had a 3-foot section of flexible copper line partially free from the wall, accessible from the inside. I used the copper line as a makeshift lever on the back window frame. The 2x4s on the outside were screwed into soft pine window trim. The trim was old. On the 4th try, the top board pulled free, screws and all, and the window swung open. I was outside by 4 in the afternoon on day 2, 58 degrees and overcast. I was wearing my jacket and my boots, and I was shaking, but not from cold. I walked to the end of the access road, about 1.5 miles. A couple in a pickup truck with a canoe on top stopped without me even having to flag them down. I must have looked like what I was. An old man who had come very close to something terrible. They drove me to a gas station with a phone. I called the sheriff's office in the county seat. I told them I needed to report an attempted murder, and I told them I had a letter signed by the person who did it. The deputy who took my statement was a young woman named, well, it doesn't matter what her name was. What matters is that she believed me immediately. She drove me to the cabin, photographed everything, bagged the envelope, and called for a detective. Reese and Chad were arrested 41 hours later at a Motel 6 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. They had been on their way somewhere, the detective told me. He didn't speculate about where. The prosecutor charged both of them. Attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy, elder abuse under Minnesota statute. Chad's gambling debts came out at the preliminary hearing. Online sports betting, wire fraud, accounts in 3 different states. The total was somewhere north of $200,000. He had apparently told Reese it was closer to 50. She found that out in a courtroom, sitting 2 tables away from him, with a public defender she'd never met. I testified for just over an hour. The prosecutor asked me to describe finding the letter. I described it. She asked me whether I believed at that time that my daughter intended my death. I said yes. She asked me whether I still believed that. I said yes. The sentence was handed down 8 months after the arrest. Chad received 12 years. Reese received 9, with eligibility for parole at 6. The judge addressed them both before the sentencing. He said something I've thought about since. He said that the cruelest part of what they had done was not the act itself, but the calculation behind it, the deliberate weaponization of a parent's love against them. I thought about Linda, about the fact that she died not knowing any of this was coming. I thought that was probably a mercy. I sold my house 6 weeks after the verdict, the house where Reese had grown up, where Linda and I had spent 31 years, where I had written all those checks at the kitchen table while telling myself it was what fathers do. I sold it and bought a smaller place about 40 minutes outside of Duluth, up near the lake. I have a dock now. I fish when I want to. Reese has written to me twice from the correctional facility. I haven't responded. I don't know that I will. People ask me how I can do that, how I can simply not respond to my own daughter's letters. And I tell them that I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question. The daughter who wrote me letters as a little girl, who fell asleep on my chest during thunderstorms, she's still the person I grieve. The person who wrote the letter I found on that kitchen table, I don't know who that is. I'm not sure she knows either. What I know is this: I checked the propane heater when I got back into that cabin after making it through the wall. It had been set to its highest setting. In that small space with the windows sealed, it would have built up enough carbon monoxide by morning to make me disoriented by 6, unconscious by 8, and dead before noon. She had thought it through. I still think about that loon call I heard before I opened the envelope. One call, then silence, like a warning delivered too gently to understand. I understand it now. I'm 64 years old. I have a truck I drive myself, a dock I built myself, and a small house that no one can take from me because there's no name on it but mine. I wake up every morning and make my coffee and watch the lake come into the light, and I think about the propane line I worked through that wall with a fish knife and 30 years of knowing how things fit together. That's what they miscalculated. They thought they knew who I was. A grieving old man who handed over money and trust without asking enough questions. They weren't entirely wrong about what I'd been, but they forgot what I'd been before that. I was the man who found the fault before the fault found me. I still am.